Hi, we continue today in a new chapter, 1 Samuel 16, and we move into the David story. And before we enter into the text itself, there are a number of issues to consider as we engage this story, and we'll go over those from the outline you see on the right side of the screen. But before I do that, I just want to note a couple of the things that lead us to face the issue here that we have to pause to look at. For example, as you can see right from the top of my page on the right side, there's a question of where one section of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel ends and where another section ends. And so scholars have generally referred to the entire two books under three different rubrics. The reign of Saul, which we've been through in 1 Samuel 1 to 15. The history of David's rise, or otherwise known as the HDR, which when you look closer, scholars disagree about where it starts and where it ends, so I've got question marks in there, but generally somewhere around right where we are, 1 Samuel 16, and then somewhere up to 2 Samuel 8, or maybe 2 Samuel 5, or other places we'll see. And then the so-called succession narrative, or SN, that follows that from 2 Samuel 9 or somewhere else, all the way through 1 Kings 1, 2, or 3, till Solomon is firmly in place. And one of the arguments is that these come from different authors, or from different time periods, or for different purposes. But the challenge is, as we'll see, that there's not only no consensus, there's so little clear evidence that scholars argue vociferously for views that are diametrically opposed to each other, and have been doing this for over 100 years and have reached no consensus, despite literally tens of thousands of pages of books and articles on these topics. So we go in a little bit agnostic about trying to find answers, but if we're going to take the books of Samuel seriously, we need to at least try to investigate some of these questions. And another aspect of this that we need to pay attention to is the character of David, larger than life. The character of Saul is not larger than life. The character of Saul is known to people who've read the Bible, but probably not very well known to people outside. But David is well known, obviously, not only in the New Testament, especially in Luke's Gospel, but elsewhere, is Jesus understood as part of David's lineage. But even to this day, the reign of David echoes through Israeli political circles. For example, in this piece from the journal First Things, which you may know as a conservative political intellectual magazine, not conservative the way we're seeing it these days in the U.S. around MAGA and denying reality, but a very thoughtful, philosophically grounded, religious view with a lot of Catholics, but not others. And obviously, Meyer Solovtchik here is Jewish. As you can see from the subtitle of this article, King David, he outlines a Jewish political theology. And he notes that Israel's history is facing a conflict that most Israeli political analysts don't look at, which is to say it wants to be a democratic republic like the United States or other European nations, but it also is waiting for the Messiah, who is to be a descendant of David and have a monarchy again. So he goes through those hard questions, just to note that even today in 2017, when he wrote this, the question of David was one still in the air. And you can see it here from this image of a statue of David there in Jerusalem, which was erected in 2011. So very current, David is still in the air. Of course, historically we know famous images of David, like Michelangelo's David, which at the time I'm recording this was recently banned for being obscene in some of the more conservative school districts and other areas in the United States. I won't even begin to get into that. As far back as we can go with some kind of material representation of David in the Common Era is from this synagogue in Capernaum from the 4th century, where there's the Magen David, the so-called Star of David, although as scholars have shown, as a symbol of Israel or symbol of Judaism, it's probably a relatively recent thing. So we really don't know what that star that you can see there meant in the 4th century. But there's a whole history of the star itself, and some of that's bound up in mythology, some of it we can find out. One last thing as we look at that, just to show this, to say that it isn't completely fanciful, here's a piece that you can see that highlights the so-called family reunion of descendants of David. People who would claim to be of his lineage throughout time. And as scholars note in there, it's impossible to determine that. There's huge gaps in the distance. And some scholars would even argue that David wasn't a real person, but that isn't stopping people in recent years from claiming descent from David. To highlight this challenge, I'd like to listen for a moment to this quote from Peter Feynman at the beginning of a section in his book Jerusalem Throne Games, where he tries to follow the question of David and the monarchy throughout the entire Bible. So he says at the beginning of his section on David, David is a critical person for this historical reconstruction. After extensive, contentious debate and discussion, scholars have reached the following consensus about the controversial figure of David. 1, he was king of Israel but not Judah. 2, he was king of Judah but not Israel. 3, he was king of Israel and Judah. 4, he was a chieftain and never became a king. 5, he never existed. It does seem certain that he was not an alien from another planet. Which is Feynman's perhaps satirical way there to highlight there is no consensus at all. But that doesn't mean we don't have to struggle with the issues. So let's go back to look at the issues here, and we'll go through some of those and see where at least the status of scholarly thought is. So I've already gone over this first part here, the question of these 3 pieces. And of course, we're on this beginning of the history of David's rise in chapter 16. And it will start, as you can already see on the left side of the screen, with Yahweh telling Samuel to call Jesse the Bethlehemite and go through his sons, because one of those is going to be the one Yahweh chose. And of course, we know who that's going to be. So let's look at these 4 questions just briefly. Authorship, time of composition and editorial work, intended audience, and the purpose of composition. And if you go on the internet, you can find many people who interpret these stories naively and literally without asking these questions, just talking about David did this and David did that, following the biblical story. But it's plainly the case that there are many difficulties in that. One is archaeological. And nobody has raised these questions more vociferously over a long period of time than the Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who made a principle of biblical archaeology. In fact, he wouldn't use the term biblical archaeology. Biblical archaeology refers to previous generations' work of trying to find archaeology that would prove the truth of the Bible. But as Finkelstein says, archaeology is its own science, art, culture. That's an argument within archaeology that we won't get into. But it needs to follow its results independent of the Bible. And if it conflicts with the Bible, so it does. And if it doesn't conflict with the Bible, so it does. So Finkelstein's interest isn't in proving the Bible's truth, but in getting whatever insights there are from archaeology. And in a popular article from one of his many, many books and articles on this, this chart is posted. It's based on Finkelstein, but notice what the author of this chart has put in there. The Bible says, and scholars say. And yet Finkelstein's views are controversial, and not all archaeologists agree with him, and many, many scholars disagree with his conclusion that there really was no David and Solomonic monarchy, that the biblical story is referring to something much later in the 8th century, in the time of Assyria, and retrojecting that back into an imaginary story of David and Solomon. And again, we don't have to agree with that, but it's hard to prove and disprove. One of the challenges archaeologically is David ruled over Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is an inhabited place, and it's obviously a tourist site and a sacred site for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and so you can't go around digging into it. You certainly can't dig in the old city under the Dome of the Rock or other places like that. So there may well be archaeological evidence that we just can't find. Most archaeology is done in what are now abandoned places out in the desert where cities used to be but aren't anymore. Very difficult to do archaeology in living cities. So that's one of the limitations of both Finkelstein's work and others, to ground archaeology as a basis for deciding one way or another of what the historical reality of the Israelite or Judahite monarchies were. So given that, that leads people to refer not just archaeologically, but to other evidence, whether that's the internal evidence of the Bible or other evidence, limited as it is from outside the Bible. And I won't go through all those details, but there are 2 pieces. One is the so-called Tel Dan Stele, which has Hebrew on it that is interpreted as House of David, but it doesn't have to be that. But it's from a long, long time ago, roughly contemporaneous with what the biblical narrative would suggest. But that's the one piece of evidence for someone called David at the time. The only other evidence archaeologically is what's called prosaically the large stone structure in Jerusalem, but what that was or what it was for is argued about. So there's just not a lot of archaeological basis other than those couple of pieces that give hints. So given that, we're looking at authorship, many options are considered. And one is that there's just a single author of the entire story all the way through, written as an explanation of the David and Solomonic monarchy. And that may be possible, and some scholars are still attributing that kind of authorship. More common, though, is that there are multiple authors at different times with conflicting perspectives, which is to say that we've seen a pro-Saul and perhaps an anti-Saul writer already. We've already seen pro-monarchy and anti-monarchy itself, and there's going to be elements of the David story that suggest that at least some of the stories seem to be critical of David in a way that you wouldn't think that a propagandistic or a celebratory version of David would imply. But another aspect that makes this difficult is we're not sure from our vantage point 3,000 or 2,500 years later what kinds of stories would have made a king sound either divinely authorized or inspired or otherwise heroic. Perhaps there are elements of what we see today which would not be considered celebratory at the time. For example, exploiting women would certainly be seen as misogynist and sexist today, but perhaps that would have been considered heroic at the time. And one of the challenges, it's hard to know. So we can read the story, but it's hard to read inside it of whether it's a given story is praising or criticizing or simply conveying without a perspective one way or the other. So we just simply don't know about multiple authors. That doesn't stop many modern scholars from arguing vociferously that they've solved it and they know exactly which verses are from which authors, when and where. But I'd like to invite you to take those all with a grain of salt. Similarly, the time of composition spreads from the 10th century BCE to the 3rd century. This should be BCE, I'm sorry, that's a typo. In the Hellenistic era, some later revisionist scholars suggesting the entire Hebrew Bible is a late Hellenistic production. That's not the view that most take, and that's involved in many political issues of our day around Israeli-Palestinians' claim to the land. So we're not going to get into that extreme. That extreme is as unlikely as the extreme that it's all literally conveying facts. It doesn't mean that truth is necessarily in the middle, but just based on the evidence, those two extremes are least likely. Then who is it written for? We can naively read the Bible and think, well, it's written for me or for us, which is to say ordinary people. But given the rarity of literacy and the elite nature of literacy and the expense of producing scrolls and the technical skill involved in making scrolls and copying scrolls, writing was for the elite. And at the time, 3,000 years ago, writing was rare and only really available among kings and monarchies. Beginning in places like Sumer, and which later became Mesopotamia and the Babylonian Empire. So I've addressed that in other videos. I won't get into all the details of the history of writing here. But if it was written at the time, then it was certainly not written for ordinary people who would not have been literate. It would have been something written for the elite, much like perhaps political journals. I don't mean what you read, on the internet through basic news sources, but the kind of scholarly journals, perhaps like First Things that I showed at the beginning, it is written for the elite to argue amongst themselves in scholarly and intellectual ways. But the story is not a scholarly intellectual argument. It's a very dramatic narrative. And so that gives many people the sense that it's for ordinary people. And so perhaps it's something like Shakespeare. Perhaps it's like Shakespeare writing Julius Caesar or other historical dramas where it's for entertainment, but they involve historical characters. But whether the entertainment involves truth about the historical characters or just uses them for the author's purpose another time, it's impossible to know without external sources. So, going back to the intended audience, it could also be for foreign kings and peoples to justify why they should offer respect to David and or Solomon. That's a possibility. That would assume that they could read the Hebrew, which is unlikely, so there's a problem there. Or the population of Judah, who wouldn't be able to read it. Perhaps it would be proclaimed for them. The only time we hear something like that is after exile, when the priest scribe Ezra reads a book, which is almost certainly some version of the form of Deuteronomy, out to the people. But they don't read it. They listen to him read it out loud as a proclamation, because they certainly couldn't have read it themselves and wouldn't have had access to it. So if the David story was for the population of Judah, it would be something proclaimed to them, but we don't know anything about a tradition of that, so we simply can't answer that question. Around the purpose of composition. So I've already mentioned the question of serious entertainment like Shakespeare, but there are several possibilities. One is the defense of David's accession to the throne. Why should David be the king? David comes from a family, Jesse, that's not distinguished for anything in particular, and Saul is still reigning. So to the extent that David has a divine claim to the throne while Saul is still reigning, that would need to be justified. Another option is that it's the defense of David's reign over Israel as opposed to Saul, that David would have had some other claim for rule over Judah and Jerusalem, which he took from the Jebusites, as we'll see in 2 Samuel. But why was David reigning over Israel, which had a different tradition? And so this could be an argument for why David reigned over both nations. It could be just a story of not an allegory as such, but a story to illustrate the mixed benefits and costs of monarchy. that a king like David can protect you from the Philistines, but also cost you plenty and suppress dissent and make the king above other people. It could be all of those, it could be none of those, and we just can't answer any of those questions. So as we go through the individual passages, I'll make reference to some of these possibilities, but the best we can do is simply read it as a story from the ancient past that's attempting to do some combination of these things, maybe. But beyond that question, we have some other details that we need to look at. For example, which actual text? Again, if you're just reading a Bible or on the screen as you see it here, there doesn't seem to be a question because there it is just laid out before you. But this is the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible was also written in Greek in the Septuagint, which is to say it's, of course, not the Hebrew Bible if it's written in Greek, but the stories that are in the Hebrew Bible that Christians call the Old Testament is also found in the Greek Septuagint from the 3rd century BCE. But the challenge is that the Hebrew text that scholars use in the modern world to translate into English or other languages is the 12th or 3rd century Masoretic Hebrew text, which is itself 1,500 or 1,600 years more recent than the Septuagint Greek. And the reason that's an issue is there are many aspects of the Hebrew text that we have in the Masoretic that are not in the Septuagint, especially in the very next chapter we're going to get to, the David and Solomon story. And that leads to opposing and opposite views that have no consensus among scholars, which is to say the Masoretic added to the earlier Septuagint, so we should read the Septuagint, or the Septuagint deleted parts from the older but unavailable Hebrew original, which the Masoretic is assumed to follow, so we should read the Masoretic. And mostly what we'll do is look at both and see how it would be different to hear those. Another issue we need to look at is how does the history of David's rise, as it's called here, relate to the succession narrative? Do we see these, as my first option suggests, as part of a single continuous narrative from whatever time of composition? Or is HDR pro-David propaganda refuted by the succession narrative from a later time and voice? As we often see in people like Suetonius, for example, who in his 12 Caesars speaks very badly about all the emperors before the time of he was writing that, to lead people to be loyal to the current empire. So perhaps it's for people at the time of Solomon who were remembering how much they loved David to get them to turn away from David and accept Solomon. That's a possibility. Another is that there were different viewpoints from whenever each was written, that they could have been each written in very different times and periods, but edited by a so-called Deuteronomistic pen in a later period. Whether Deuteronomistic pen is in the time of Josiah, in the late 7th, early 6th century, or some other time, perhaps in the Persian period after exile, where further edits and changes were made. And the reality is there's almost no solid basis for reaching any of those conclusions. So it's a very difficult text to follow in that kind of way. Finally, on this sheet, how does the HDR or the SN relate to other texts in the Hebrew Bible, which is to say we have to ask which text they knew and which they didn't know based on when we imagine one was written. So, for example, in the Friedman piece I looked at in the beginning, he posits what he calls the King David Bible and uses Genesis as part of a text from the same author as he thinks David was. Not to say he doesn't think there were edits later, but he thinks that Genesis was written at the same time. As we'll see, there are many echoes in Genesis and the story of David, but I've read it as the Genesis is an exilic story that's criticizing the David story, implicitly at least, never explicitly. Of course, it couldn't, from its time period, refer to thousands of years in the future when there'd be a monarchy. It's enough that it refers to the exile, to the Exodus in the story of Abraham. But if Genesis is later, then we can read Genesis as a critique of monarchy and urbanization that the David story takes for granted. But what if it's not? What if the David story is actually written later, at around the same time as Genesis or some other time? Is the HDR part of the larger composition known as the Deuteronomistic history that goes from Joshua to 2 Kings? But there's a plethora of writing on that argues about the whole Deuteronomistic history, whether there is such a thing as one continuous narrative, and if so, how it came to be, and the arguments there are just as thick and contentious as they are here around the David story. And then finally, there's the argument that I will follow mostly, that the HDR is older than some but newer than others written independently, and we'll have to just assess that as we go. So let's look at a couple things, given all those issues, and a couple of things that set us in some context for why this is an issue. So David will be introduced in this story here, but I've placed on the screen the 3 parallel versions of David's introduction to the story here. Here, in this first part, he's introduced as Yahweh's anointed, which we can see in the beginning, and I bolded that, where Yahweh says to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I've rejected him. Fill your horn with oil and set out." And Yahweh's going to point out another king. But right after that is another story that the Spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from Yahweh tormented him, and they look for someone who can help ease Saul's pain, interior pain, by playing music for him. And that is also young David. So David is introduced as a musician, independent of any question of being a Messiah or anything else. And then in a much smaller print, which is the introduction in the Philistine story of David and Goliath, the most famous story here, David is introduced here as if we don't know the other stories, as someone, a young man who's a shepherd boy and curious about what's going on, and claims that he's killed lions and bears so he can take upon this Philistine who's dissed the God of Israel. Scholars find ways to read all those consistently. They don't have to be read as if they're from separate sources, but most scholars see these as inconsistent, and it really takes a lot of work to try to not see these as having inconsistencies. So as we go through these, we're going to have to ask, what happens if you read these each as the only one you knew, and what happens when we read them as we have them in the Hebrew Bible, in the sequence we have them there. One last thing about this before we stop this overview for today. I built up this chiastic structure from various work that other people have done, and at least this will get us through this part, not the whole HDR, which goes through at least some part of 2 Samuel, but at least the second half of 1 Samuel. And you see it's framed by the metaphorical death of Saul the king, Yahweh deciding that Saul's reign is ended, even though Saul will be alive throughout this whole section, and it ends with the physical death of Saul and his son Jonathan, beloved of David. Then it continues with David's career, and David rejects by defeating the Philistines, and it ends with the flip side that the Philistines reject David. Then in the green parts we see David with Samuel at Ramah, the only time David will be with the living Samuel, and Saul among the prophets with Samuel, and at the end Saul will call up the spirit of Samuel from the dead at Ramah. Then in the D parts we'll see David fleeing to King Achish of Gath, which is to say to the Philistines, to hide from Saul. And then on the other side, David will be as a vassal to the king, the same king among the Philistines, working as a mercenary for the Philistine army. Then after that, we'll see David hides at a place called Ziph, and there's a covert theft from Saul, and he's called Yahweh's Messiah, and we see the parallel here just a couple of chapters later. And at the center is the so-called parable of Nabal. It's in quotes there because in the story it's not a parable. In the story it's an encounter between Nabal the fool and his wife Abigail. But given that this man's name is Fool, and that's not likely to be anybody's name, many scholars read this as a parable based on things like Proverbs, which may or may not have been written before or after. The clever do all things intelligently, but the fool displays folly, and suggests that the Nabal story is an example of that. So we'll be looking at that shape as we go through. So those are some of the issues we need to look at, and next video we'll begin to see how Samuel responds to Yahweh's telling him to stop grieving over Saul. See you then. Bye-bye.